So Donald Trump hung up on the Prime Minister of Canada mid-sentence during a bilateral call that both nations had agreed was the final opportunity to resolve the trade crisis through direct negotiation before the next round of escalation. Mark Carney was 11 minutes into a 45-minute scheduled call, reportedly mid-sentence, presenting the third provision of a comprehensive compromise framework that Canadian officials had spent 3 weeks preparing when the line went dead. Not a technical failure, not a dropped connection. The President of the United States terminated the call while the Prime Minister of Canada was speaking, and the line did not reconnect because it was not meant to. For 6 hours after the call ended, Ottawa said nothing. No statement, no press conference, no leaked fury, no emergency media availability, nothing. Washington interpreted the silence as shock, as evidence that the hang-up had landed exactly as intended, that Carney had been stunned into submission by the most primal display of dominance in the diplomatic playbook. Senior White House advisors told colleagues that the silence proved Canada understood who held the power. One advisor reportedly said, "He got the message. Sometimes you have to show them who's in charge." Washington was wrong. The silence was not shock, and it was not submission. The silence was the sound of a government preparing the most devastating single-day retaliatory package in the history of relations between allied democracies. Within 24 hours, Canada announced 5 simultaneous retaliatory measures so comprehensive and so precisely targeted that trade analysts struggled to find a historical comparison. Immediate tariffs on American exports across 7 politically sensitive sectors, energy export restrictions affecting 12 American states, the recall of the Canadian ambassador to the United States, the first in the history of the bilateral relationship, the suspension of defense cooperation frameworks, including elements of NORAD joint operations, and one measure that nobody in Washington had anticipated, a complete regulatory freeze on American financial institutions operating in Canadian markets. Every single measure was linked, in the official Canadian government statement, not to trade policy, not to tariffs, not to any economic grievance, but to what Ottawa formally described as the conduct of the President of the United States during bilateral diplomatic communications. Warren Buffett said Trump just demonstrated the single most expensive impulse in business or politics, and then explained why more deals, more partnerships, and more alliances are destroyed by 5 seconds of disrespect than by 5 years of disagreement. But it is what Carney said in his public response, 9 words delivered with a coldness that silenced the room and reached every camera on earth, that tells you this crisis has crossed a line that policy concessions cannot uncross. When you hear what was actually being discussed on that call, what Carney was offering when the line went dead, what Ottawa did during those 6 silent hours while Washington was celebrating, what the retaliatory package actually contains, and what Buffett says always happens when powerful people confuse contempt for leverage, you will understand why this phone call may be the most expensive 11 minutes in modern diplomatic history. Hit subscribe because Carney has made it clear that the response is not finished. Let me take you through what was actually happening on that call, because the context makes the hang-up not just rude, it makes it the most self-destructive 11 minutes of this entire confrontation. The call had been arranged through back-channel negotiations over 2 weeks. Both governments agreed it would serve as a direct leader-to-leader attempt to find a resolution before the trade war entered its next phase, a phase that both sides' economic advisors had warned would cause irreversible structural damage to the bilateral relationship. The Canadian side prepared extensively. Carney's trade team, as National Security Council, and his economic advisors spent 3 weeks building a comprehensive compromise framework, a package of mutual concessions designed not just to resolve the immediate tariff dispute, but to establish a new bilateral trade architecture with binding dispute resolution mechanisms that would prevent future crises from escalating to this point. The framework was serious, it was detailed, and it was designed with a political calculation that revealed how carefully Ottawa had studied the American domestic landscape. The deal was structured so that Trump could claim victory. The compromise offered partial rollback of Canadian retaliatory measures, the energy restrictions, the mineral export limitations, the regulatory barriers that had been costing American industries billions. In exchange, it asked for partial rollback of American tariffs and a commitment to a structured negotiation timeline for remaining disputes. It included an energy cooperation provision that would have locked in Canadian energy exports to the United States at preferential rates for 15 years, a provision that, according to Canadian economic modeling, would have reduced American consumer heating costs by an estimated 11% across the Northeast and Midwest. It included expedited critical mineral supply agreements that American defense contractors had been lobbying for desperately, and it included a joint infrastructure investment framework that would have funneled billions into cross-border projects in states that the president needed for his electoral coalition. Every provision was designed with dual purpose, substantive economic benefit paired with political benefit that the White House could announce as a win. This was not a hostile framework. This was an off-ramp built by the other side specifically to let you exit the highway with your dignity intact. The call began at 2:15 in the afternoon Eastern Time. Present on the Canadian side were Carney, the finance minister, the foreign affairs minister, the chief trade negotiator, and 4 senior advisors. Present on the American side were the president, the trade representative, the national security advisor, and 2 senior staff. According to officials from both governments who have provided accounts of the call, accounts that are consistent across 5 separate sources, the tone was difficult from the first minute. Trump opened not with the customary diplomatic pleasantries, but with a demand that Canada immediately and unilaterally reverse all retaliatory measures before any American concessions would be discussed. Carney responded that the framework he was about to present addressed both sides' concerns simultaneously and suggested they hear the full proposal before responding to any individual element. Trump interrupted. Carney continued. Trump interrupted again. Carney, according to Canadian officials, maintained his composure and began walking through the framework provision by provision with the systematic precision of the central banker he once was. At the 11-minute mark, Carney was mid-sentence, presenting the energy cooperation provision, the provision that would have lowered American heating costs and secured energy supply for 15 years. He was explaining the pricing mechanism, the volume commitments, and the estimated consumer savings. According to 3 officials who were on the call, Trump interrupted a final time and said, his exact words, confirmed by sources on both sides, "Mark, this isn't working. You people don't get it. Call me when you're ready to be serious." The line went dead. Canadian officials on the call sat in silence for several seconds waiting for the connection to restore. It did not restore. The President of the United States had terminated the call. The scheduled 45 minutes had lasted 11. The 3-week compromise framework had been heard for approximately 7 minutes. And the energy provision that would have saved American consumers billions over 15 years had been interrupted mid-sentence by a dial tone. And then nothing. For 6 hours and 14 minutes, Ottawa said nothing publicly. And what happened during those 6 hours is the reason this story ends the way it does. Washington filled the silence with celebration. Within an hour of the call ending, leaks from the White House began framing the hang-up as a strategic display of dominance. One senior official told a reporter, "The president made clear that he's not going to sit through lectures from a country that should be grateful for the relationship it has." Another described the hang-up as the kind of move that reminds everyone who sits at the head of the table. Cable news panels spent the afternoon debating whether the hang-up was unpresidential or the tough negotiating style that voters elected him for. By evening, the White House communications team had settled on a narrative. The president had sent a message that Canada's terms were unacceptable and that further discussion required a fundamentally different Canadian approach. The narrative was confident, the narrative was wrong, and the narrative ensured that the hang-up was owned publicly, on the record, by the White House, which meant that when the counterstrike arrived, there would be no plausible deniability, no claim of technical failure, no suggestion that the call had simply concluded. Inside Ottawa, the 6 hours were the opposite of silent. Carney convened an emergency cabinet session within 20 minutes of the call ending. The session took place in the Privy Council chamber and lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. The discussion was not about whether to respond. That decision, according to officials present, had been made before Carney sat down. The discussion was about calibration. Every retaliatory option was evaluated against 3 criteria. Was it proportional to the insult? Was it devastating enough to be unmistakable? And was it structured to maintain the moral high ground that Canada would need for international support? Legal teams finalized the retaliatory orders that had been drafted in contingency weeks earlier, because Carney's government, having experienced the pattern of American diplomatic behavior over 2 years, had prepared response packages for a range of provocations, including precisely this one. Diplomatic teams notified allied capitals through secure channels. Economic teams ran final impact assessments on both the Canadian and American economies. The Canadian ambassador to the United States was formally recalled to Ottawa for consultations, the first such recall in the 158-year history of the relationship. At 8:29 in the evening, 6 hours and 14 minutes after the line went dead, the Canadian government issued a simultaneous announcement across every available channel. The announcement was delivered not by Carney, but jointly by the finance minister, the foreign affairs minister, and the defense minister. A deliberate choice that signaled this was not a personal response from a prime minister who had been insulted, but an institutional response from a sovereign government whose head of state had been treated with contempt. The choreography itself was a message. You hung up on one person, but you were hearing back from an entire country. The retaliatory package was 5 measures announced simultaneously, each targeting a different dimension of the bilateral relationship, each designed to impose maximum cost with maximum precision. The first measure was immediate. Emergency tariffs on American exports across 7 sectors: agricultural products, manufactured goods, technology hardware, pharmaceutical ingredients, financial services, entertainment media, and construction materials. The tariffs were calibrated to hit the electoral map rather than the economic map, concentrated in sectors dominant in swing states that the president could not afford to lose. The total estimated cost to American exporters, $4.7 billion annually. Not threatened, not proposed, effective at midnight. The second measure was energy. Canada reduced, not suspended, but strategically reduced, natural gas and electricity exports to 12 American states, cutting supply by 18%. Not enough to trigger the full energy crisis that a complete cutoff would cause, but enough to spike heating costs, enough to make headlines in every affected state, and enough to demonstrate that the larger weapon remained loaded and available. The 18% reduction was itself a message. We could have done 100%. We chose 18. Notice the restraint. Notice what we are choosing not to do. Yet, the third measure was diplomatic. The Canadian ambassador was formally recalled to Ottawa. All bilateral meetings, working groups, joint committees, and cooperative frameworks were suspended indefinitely. The suspension was conditioned in the official statement on a demonstration of diplomatic conduct consistent with the norms governing relations between sovereign democracies. That language was chosen with surgical precision. It made resumption of normal diplomacy contingent not on a policy change but on a behavioral change. You cannot buy your way back to the table with tariff concessions. You can only return to the table by demonstrating that you will treat the person across from you with the respect that sovereign leaders owe each other. The fourth measure targeted security cooperation. Specific elements of defense collaboration were suspended pending a comprehensive review, joint military exercises, intelligence sharing protocols under the Five Eyes framework, and NORAD operational coordination on specific continental defense functions. This measure was designed not to weaken continental security. Both governments understood the mutual necessity of defense cooperation, but to send a signal that reached the one constituency in Washington that the White House could not afford to alienate: the Pentagon. The Department of Defense has historically been the most pro-Canada institution in the American government, and disrupting the defense relationship guaranteed that military leadership would apply internal pressure for resolution with an urgency that economic damage alone could not generate. The fifth measure was the one nobody had wargamed. A complete regulatory freeze on American financial institutions operating in Canadian markets, affecting banks, investment firms, insurance companies, and fintech operations with Canadian licenses. The freeze did not expel American financial firms. It froze their ability to open new accounts, launch new products, execute new transactions, or expand existing operations. For the 5 largest American banks, each of which has significant Canadian operations, the freeze represented an immediate revenue disruption and a long-term strategic threat. If the freeze persisted, Canadian market share would flow to European, Asian, and domestic competitors who would not give it back when the freeze lifted. One Wall Street analyst said on a Monday morning call that was leaked within hours, "The financial freeze is the measure that will get resolved last and cost the most because market share lost during a regulatory freeze does not come back. This is permanent damage disguised as a temporary measure." And then Carney spoke. Not through ministers, not through institutional statements, personally. And what he said made it clear that the line between trade dispute and something deeper had been permanently crossed. The setting was the House of Commons. Every member present. The diplomatic gallery filled with ambassadors from 30 countries who had requested seats, an extraordinary level of international attention for a domestic parliamentary address. Carney stood at the podium with no notes. The chamber was silent before he began, a silence that reflected the gravity that every person in the room already understood. He spoke with a tone that was not angry. Anger would have been easier for the White House to dismiss. What Carney delivered was colder than anger. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision and was simply informing the world of what that decision was and why it had been made. He addressed the call directly and without euphemism. Yesterday afternoon, I called the President of the United States. The call was scheduled for 45 minutes. It was agreed upon by both governments as the final opportunity for direct resolution of the crisis that has defined this relationship for 2 years. My government had spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive compromise framework, a framework that addressed American economic concerns, that offered American consumers real savings, that secured American supply chains, and that was deliberately structured to allow both sides to claim progress. He paused. The call lasted 11 minutes. The President terminated it while I was speaking. The last sound I heard from the leader of our closest ally was a dial tone. He let the word land. A dial tone. Another pause. There are many things a sovereign nation can absorb during a difficult negotiation. Economic pressure, we have absorbed it. Harsh rhetoric, we have endured it. Unreasonable demands, we have heard them. Those are the instruments of hard bargaining, and Canada has demonstrated for 2 years that it can withstand every one of them without compromising its sovereignty or its composure. His voice dropped half a register. But there is one thing no nation can absorb and maintain its self-respect: contempt. The President of the United States did not reject our proposal. He did not counter it. He did not engage with it. He hung up, and hanging up is not a negotiating position. It is a statement that the other party does not deserve to be heard. He looked directly into the camera. I have a message for the President, and I will keep it as brief as you kept our call. 9 words. You hung up, we showed up. Notice the difference? The chamber erupted. The ovation lasted over a minute. Every party, every MP, the diplomatic gallery on their feet. Within 10 minutes, the quote was trending in 14 countries. Within an hour, it was the headline of every major news outlet in the English-speaking world. Within 24 hours, notice the difference had become a phrase that encapsulated not just this crisis, but the entire 2-year arc of the confrontation. The difference between impulsive contempt and calculated response, between a leader who cannot finish a phone call and a nation that will not accept being dismissed. But here is the detail that transforms the hang-up from an insult into a catastrophe. The detail that makes those 11 minutes not just rude, but possibly the most expensive 5 seconds of this entire presidency. The compromise framework that Carney was presenting when the line went dead was, by every objective analysis that has since been conducted, the best deal the United States had been offered at any point in the 2-year confrontation. The energy provision alone, the one interrupted by the hang-up, would have secured Canadian natural gas and electricity exports to the United States at preferential rates for 15 years, saving American consumers an estimated $47 billion over the life of the agreement. The critical mineral provisions would have guaranteed American defense contractors priority access to Canadian nickel, cobalt, and lithium, materials the Pentagon has identified as strategically essential and currently at risk. The trade provisions would have reopened Canadian markets to American agricultural and manufactured exports worth an estimated $12 billion annually. The total economic value of the framework to the United States, calculated by 3 independent economic analyses published in the week following the call, ranged from $89 to $114 billion over a 10-year horizon. Carney made clear in his parliamentary address that the framework had been withdrawn permanently. The offer that was on the table yesterday is no longer on the table. It will not be resubmitted. It will not be renegotiated. A nation does not spend 3 weeks building a compromise for a partner who will not spend 45 minutes listening to it. And this is where the story stops being about a phone call and starts being about something that governs every relationship between every nation on earth. The distinction is between disagreement and contempt. And the distinction matters because the two produce fundamentally different responses. Disagreement is productive. It means both sides are engaged. It means both sides value the negotiation enough to argue over terms. You can impose punishing tariffs and still be at the table. You can make unreasonable demands and still be in the conversation. You can walk away from a deal and come back the next day with a counteroffer. Disagreement is the engine of negotiation, and it produces outcomes because both parties retain the belief that the other side takes them seriously. Contempt destroys that belief. Hanging up the phone mid-sentence is not a negotiating tactic. It is a declaration that the person on the other end of the line is not worth your time, and once that declaration is made, the negotiation is over, not because the issues are unresolvable, but because the relationship has been damaged in a way that no policy concession can repair. You cannot offer better trade terms to someone you have told, through the most primal possible gesture, that their voice does not deserve to be heard. Warren Buffett's response was about something he has watched destroy more deals, more partnerships, and more fortunes than any market crash or competitive threat in his 70 years of business. The incalculable cost of 5 seconds of disrespect. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have watched more deals die from disrespect than from disagreement. And I want to be specific about what I mean because people confuse the two constantly. Disagreement is when you think the other side's price is too high. Disrespect is when you think the other side's time isn't worth yours. Disagreement can be resolved in the next meeting. Disrespect follows you into every meeting for the rest of the relationship. What happened on that phone call was not a disagreement over trade terms. It was a display of contempt, and contempt is the one thing that turns a negotiable situation into an unnegotiable one. He applied it with the precision of someone who has lost money to this exact mistake. I once lost a deal I wanted badly, an acquisition that would have been one of the best Berkshire ever made. The company was family-owned, third generation. The kind of operation I love to buy because the family's pride in the business is the business's greatest asset. We were in advanced negotiations. The price was agreed, the structure was agreed, and then a member of my team, a person I trusted, a person who was otherwise excellent at their job, was dismissive to the family's eldest daughter during a site visit. Not hostile, not rude in any way that would show up in a complaint. Dismissive. Checked his phone while she was talking. Interrupted her to ask about the financials. Treated her as though she was not a decision maker in her own family's company. Buffett paused. The family walked away. They sold the company to another buyer for less money. And when I called the patriarch to ask what had happened, he said one sentence that I have never forgotten: "I don't do business with people who don't think my family deserves their attention." That sentence cost Berkshire more money than I will specify. The hang-up just cost the United States considerably more. He went deeper into the psychology with the clarity of a man who has spent decades studying human behavior in high-stakes environments. Here is what powerful people consistently fail to understand about contempt. They think it demonstrates strength. They think hanging up, walking out, keeping someone waiting, interrupting, dismissing. They think these gestures show that they are in control. They are wrong. These gestures show that they are threatened. Confident people do not hang up. Confident people listen, because listening costs nothing and reveals everything. The person who hangs up is the person who is afraid of what they might hear if they stay on the line. And the person on the other end of the line always understands this. Carney knows that Trump hung up because the compromise was good, so good that staying on the line might have required accepting it, and accepting it would have meant acknowledging that Canada had built a better deal than the United States. The hang-up was not strength, it was flight. The Berkshire parallel expanded into a universal principle that silenced the room. I have sat in hundreds of negotiations and I have observed one pattern that is absolute. The moment one party shows contempt for the other, the negotiation transforms. It is no longer about the deal. It is about dignity. And the price of dignity is infinite, meaning the party that has been disrespected will accept worse economic terms, will absorb greater costs, will endure more pain than any rational calculation would justify, simply to demonstrate that they cannot be treated with contempt and expected to comply. Carney's retaliatory package is not proportional to the trade dispute. It is proportional to the insult, and that is why it is so devastating, because the trade dispute has a price, and the insult does not. His closing was one sentence that landed with the weight of 7 decades of accumulated wisdom. The most expensive sound in business is a dial tone when the other side was still talking. And then the cost of hanging up that phone arrived, not as diplomatic language, not as abstract economic projections, but as damage measured in billions, in jobs, in market value, and in the trust that holds the most important bilateral relationship on the continent together. The tariffs hit first. American exporters woke up Monday morning to a new cost structure that repriced their Canadian operations overnight. Agricultural exporters in the Midwest, corn, soy, wheat, dairy, faced tariffs that made their products uncompetitive against South American and European alternatives that Canadian buyers immediately pivoted toward. Technology companies with Canadian operations faced hardware tariffs that disrupted supply chains already strained by the broader trade war. The total first-week impact, as calculated by the American Farm Bureau and the National Association of Manufacturers jointly, exceeded $900 million, and the tariffs had only been in effect for 5 days. The energy reduction created the precise political pressure it was designed to create. Natural gas prices in the 12 affected states rose between 14% and 22% within the first week. Heating cost projections for the approaching winter were revised upward across the Northeast and Midwest. The governor of Michigan, the state that sits directly across the border from Canada and depends most heavily on Canadian energy, held a press conference that captured the fury of the moment. "My constituents are going to pay more to heat their homes this winter because the President of the United States could not be bothered to stay on a phone call for 45 minutes. That is where we are." The governor of Minnesota said, "I need someone in Washington to explain to the families in my state why their heating bills are going up because the president hung up on a man who was offering us cheaper energy." 3 Republican senators from energy-affected states issued a joint statement that stopped short of criticizing the president directly, but demanded immediate diplomatic engagement to resolve the current disruption language that everyone in Washington understood as a demand that someone apologize without using the word. The financial freeze produced panic in a sector that had assumed it was immune to bilateral trade actions. The 5 largest American banks collectively hold over $200 billion in Canadian assets, deposits, loans, investment portfolios, insurance operations, mortgage servicing. The regulatory freeze did not threaten those existing assets. but it eliminated the ability to grow, to compete for new business, to launch products, and to defend market share against competitors who were not frozen. Bank stocks dropped between 3 and 6% on the first trading day. One J.P. Morgan analyst wrote in a client note, "The financial freeze is a slow-acting poison. Every week it continues. Canadian market share flows to competitors who will not return it. This is not a tariff that can be reversed. This is a structural competitive loss that compounds over time." The diplomatic recall created consequences that extended far beyond symbolism. Without an ambassador in Washington, routine bilateral business, visa processing, consular services, regulatory coordination, cross-border commerce facilitation degraded immediately. Canadian citizens in the United States and American citizens in Canada found themselves navigating bureaucratic systems that had lost their primary facilitator. Cross-border business operations that depended on diplomatic channels for permits, approvals, and dispute resolution found those channels closed. The practical cost of severing the human infrastructure of the relationship was vast, distributed, and felt by millions of people who had nothing to do with trade policy and had never heard the phone call that triggered the crisis. The international reaction focused on a question that every allied leader was now asking privately and several were asking publicly. If the American president will hang up on Canada, on a G7 ally, a NATO partner, a Five Eyes member, the nation that shares the longest peaceful border in human history, will he hang up on me? Japan's prime minister raised the concern in a meeting with the British prime minister, and the substance of the conversation was leaked within hours. France's foreign minister said publicly that diplomatic courtesy is not a luxury, it is the infrastructure of international cooperation, and when that infrastructure is damaged, every relationship built upon it is weakened. One European diplomat, speaking on condition of anonymity, was more blunt. Every leader who has a phone call scheduled with the American president is now calculating whether to proceed or to cancel, not because they fear the policy disagreement, because they fear the humiliation. And a superpower that its allies fear being humiliated by is a superpower that is losing its allies. American domestic politics fractured along a line that no strategist had anticipated. The line between people who had been on the call and people who had not. Officials from the American side of the call, the trade representative, the national security advisor, senior staff were reportedly furious, not at Canada, but at the president. One official who was present told colleagues, in comments that were reported by 3 separate outlets within 48 hours, "We had a deal. We were listening to a deal that gave us everything we have been asking for, and he hung up because he didn't want to listen to the details. This isn't tough negotiation, this is self-sabotage." The National Security Advisor reportedly told the Secretary of Defense that the defense cooperation suspension was the direct and predictable consequence of a decision I watched happen in real time and could not prevent. Congressional reactions split between those who defended the president's right to negotiate his way and those who could see the economic and diplomatic damage accumulating in their districts by the hour. One Republican senator from an energy-affected state said privately, "He hung up on cheap energy for my constituents. How do I defend that? I can't. Nobody can. So here is where we stand." The President of the United States hung up on the Prime Minister of Canada, mid-sentence, mid-compromise, mid-offer, after 11 minutes of a scheduled 45-minute call. For 6 hours, Ottawa prepared in silence while Washington celebrated. Then Canada announced 5 simultaneous retaliatory measures: emergency tariffs across 7 sectors, an 18% energy export reduction affecting 12 states, the recall of the Canadian ambassador, the suspension of defense cooperation elements, and a regulatory freeze on American financial institutions operating in Canadian markets. A compromise framework worth an estimated $89 to $114 billion over 10 years, a deal designed for both sides to win, was permanently withdrawn. Mark Carney stood in the House of Commons and said 9 words: "You hung up, we showed up. Notice the difference." And Warren Buffett explained why the hang-up produced a response disproportionate